The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's Africa editor, Geraud from the beautiful island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. A very good afternoon to you, Geraud.
Good afternoon to you, Eric.
Geraud, I've been looking forward to our discussion today, in part because there's been a lot of talk on an area that you specialize in terms of cobalt, child mining, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, your native country. And that discussion is taking place in Washington this week, where there was a bipartisan gathering of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. This is one of these committees that's formed in recent years to look at every aspect of the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese influence in the United States, and they are quite entertaining. They kind of say the same thing over and over again, China bad, China bad, China bad, China bad. But occasionally they have some interesting things, and this week they did. They held a hearing this week, and this is, by the way, if you're not familiar with this committee, it's unusual in that it's made up of both senators and representatives. That's a little bit unusual to have both sides of the legislature participate in these committees. Their hearing this week was From Cobalt to Cars, How China Exploits Child and Forced Labor in the Congo. And Geraud, to be honest with you, when I first heard this, I was like, oh God, here we go again. And we go again because we have been hearing the same things out of these same people for the past, at least 5 or 6 years, and nothing seems to change. However, this time does seem to be a little different because they're actually now talking about new legislation, and they're actually talking about much stricter measures to sanction Chinese companies, individuals, and even Congolese companies and people who are involved in what they call child labor, which is from the artisanal mines. And so let's take a listen to some of the sound bites from this hearing. And I want to get your reaction, Geraud, just so you can kind of give us some context as to whether or not what they're saying is accurate and feasible. So let's start with Christopher Smith, who is a Republican from New Jersey and a longtime critic of China's mining practices in the DR Congo. He is also chairman of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. He said it's time to rethink the approach to dealing with Chinese mining companies and the refining of cobalt from the Congo. And he's going to introduce legislation in the House this week that will be modeled on the law that banned imports into the United States from companies in China that are operating in Xinjiang.
The United States has been, at best, asleep at the wheel, or worse, complicit and enabling, for far too long, and China has taken advantage of that. We need to provide alternative options that champion transparency, human rights, peace, and prosperity for all. This week, I will be introducing legislation to ensure that goods made using or containing cobalt refined in the PRC does not enter the United States market under the presumption that it is extracted or processed with the use of child and forced labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Among its provisions, the bill called the China's Odious and Brutally Atrocious Labor Trafficking Supply Chain, or Cobalt Supply Chain Act, will, and as we did with the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, requires the Customs Commissioner to apply the presumption. It's a rebuttable presumption, but a presumption unless the Commissioner determines that the importer of record of the covered goods being imported has, one, demonstrated by clear and convincing evidence that the covered goods were not made or manufactured in the PRC or using or containing cobalt, or demonstrated by clear and convincing evidence that the covered goods from the PRC contain no trace of cobalt extracted or processed in the DRC.
Now, Geraud, that is a new proposition that we haven't heard before, that the United States might enact laws that try to restrict the importation of refined cobalt from China. Now, let's just be very clear here in the process. There is a long way to go from a lawmaker like Chris Smith saying that he's going to introduce a law and to this thing actually ending up becoming a law. Nonetheless, They are proposing legislation like this now. What do you think?
I do think it's going to take a bit of time to see, first of all, that proposition to be really passed as law in the US Congress and to be accepted by the different stakeholders. Those stakeholders being the tech companies and the automaker companies in the US. Because when he makes that suggestion, I was just thinking about how much cobalt is present in different and various electronic products that are sold in the US. I really wonder how efficient it's going to be able to go down to the details to be sure that the phone is using or the Apple is using doesn't have a trace of cobalt that was somehow went through China or passed any through different supply chain that has China present on it. So for me, it's a bold idea. From that boldness, let's see what's going to come out of it. But from a realistic point of view, I'm still kind of curious to see how it's going to come to pass, taking into account various stakeholders that needs, which interests are really at stake in those kind of laws, if this kind of law comes to be enacted. And I would like just to add another comment, because when I was hearing the testimony and his introduction speech, and those words kind of came up a lot during the testimony, forced child labors and everything, I was like, I'm really curious to know how they do define those words and how they do define those concepts within the US Congress and the different American stakeholders when they forced about forced child labors. There's only one congressman who talked about slave laborers. I was like, okay, I'm really curious, because so far those words have been thrown out into the narrative, creating a kind of understanding or picture in the mind of many of how things are happening down in DRC. But when you go down in DRC, you realize that sometimes it's not really what you picture, it's what you've pictured before because of the word that you've been using. So I'm really kind of curious on how they do define those words and how they kind of use them and what's the impression they want to give people when they use those words.
The definitions are very important, but also the framing as well. They made this sound like China is in charge of everything in the Congo when it comes to cobalt. Give us a little bit of a sense, based on your research and the data that you've looked through on our site that's available that maps out the entire Congo cobalt supply chain. What role do the Chinese have, particularly in the artisanal sector where child labor is an issue?
It was really interesting when you hear the testimony. You hear that, artisanal mining unregulated in DRC. There's no regulation on that. It's like, first of all, that's not true. You have an entire institution in DRC dedicated for artisanal mining, not only for those happening in cobalt, but in different mines in all over in DRC. There are laws about artisanal mining. There are structures. And those who are operating those artisanal mines are cooperative that they've been registered. They have paperwork. They have like traceability where you can see who's the owner. And when we visit some of those artisanal sites, you could find, we had some pictures, you could find the regulation they've put: no women allowed, no pregnant women allowed here, no underage children allowed here. They've put a certain norms of rules and regulation. And of course, you have many of them. And when I say many of them, when you go to that institution DRC, you do find those artisanal sites registered with the paperwork, knowing who's the owner. And let me be clear, there's no foreign owners of artisanal mine in the DRC. It's not allowed. There's no Chinese owning an artisanal mine in DRC. There are none. That needs to be clear.
But there are children, though, right?
They are children. Yes, of course they are children. And this is where the context matters a lot. They are children, because when you hear the narrative that's presented, you have the feeling that they come to tell you, the Chinese company incentivize forced child laborers and creating a sort of cause to effect narrative between Chinese companies and child laborers in the cobalt in DRC, which is not the case. Which is absolutely not the case. There is a much larger context of poverty and issues down there where you do find that, because the Chinese are present down along the supply chain, where the Chinese do buy cobalt, not only the industrial mine they do have, but also from the artisanal site. And among those artisanal sites, some of them you do find child working there, and some of them you do not find child working there. And where you do find child working there, most of them, they come with families. It's organized with families, because what people don't get, for the big majority of those people, they come with the family because it's about poverty and survival. They don't have another option than doing that. And there is a very interesting report that was published a few months ago by a British NGO from Impact that was talking about that and saying that most of the revenue that people use for the labors they do in the cobalt, they use it to pay school, to get food, to get clothes and everything. It's not something that people like, you have a Chinese coming with a gun, you guys come here, start to work there. That's not true. And that's what I was saying. The image they tend to portray when they use those words is kind of like, okay, people tend to see we have Chinese master with guns, come to villages, taking children and sending them to the artisanal mine and take the cobalt from there, which is not the real picture on the ground.
Well, let's listen to some more of the testimony from the committee. This from Milos Ivkovic, who is an international arbitrator and an adjunct professor at Washington University School of Law. I had not heard of Milos before, but he was quite informed on the issue, and I really recommend everybody to check out his testimony that he gave before the committee. And again, he introduced a new concept into the debate about elevating what's happening in the DRC, particularly related to child mining, into a criminal act.
In the absence of, and I underline, positive incentives, such as non-market interventions and direct governmental support, Western companies may have little motive to enter additional segments such as refining or mining themselves. Notwithstanding positive actions, so long as crimes go unpunished and actors responsible for the worst forms of child labor enjoy effective immunity, it is difficult to expect rapid and meaningful change. Hence, a careful consideration of tangible consequences has to take place. The first one has been mentioned by Chairman, and this is potentially a temporary suspension of international trade or import of cobalt-related products into the United States. The positive effects of such an act are that the US, by virtue of its market position, can exert far more dominant pressure than commercial actors themselves independently, and thus influence the triggering of remedial market practices. It should be noted, however, that an absolute ban on imports may have negative short-term effects on the US market, an issue that can be resolved as drafted in the Countering China's Exploitation of Strategic Minerals and Child Labor in the DRC Act through licensing and due diligence requirements. The second, and observing the sheer scale of uninterrupted violations of fundamental human rights for over more than a decade and potentially lethal nature of the worst forms of child labor in the DRC, are the sanctions on states, companies, and individuals involved in these practices. And the third one are criminal investigations. Let it be clear that not only I, but many of my colleagues believe that child labor in hazardous conditions constitutes a violation of peremptory norms of international law and have to be criminally prosecuted. Inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental health, if widespread or systematic and directed against civilian population, are crimes against humanity. So we arguably have a legal obligation to act.
Wow. Sanctions, a ban on import, and redefining what's happening as a crime against humanity. What's your reaction?
I'm really curious when you say crime against humanity, who are they going to indict in this process?
Well, I think they would go after Gécamines, they would go after CEIP, they would go after all of the different people who are buying the cobalt from the artisanal mines. Anybody who's implicated in the sale and processing of cobalt that would be from artisanal mines. And as we know that the artisanal mine cobalt is mixed in with the industrial mine cobalt, so it could potentially criminalize large swaths of the industry.
So they're going to be indicted them based on the fact that they might be buying, because on the fact that the supply chain might be containing cobalt.
Correct. And now, as we heard from Christopher Smith in the beginning, in the first soundbite, it would be up to the company or the individual to prove that they don't have child labor mined cobalt in their supply chain, which is very difficult to do. But that would be the burden if you combine the two measures together, what Chris Smith said and then what Milos said.
So I kind of wonder what they expect to be the outcome of it, because I don't see how that would change the situation on the ground. Because as I said earlier, it will not stop families to go on mining sites to find money. It will not. It won't do that at all. Because when they do that, they kind of seems to forget that there is a large poverty issues there that's in play. So you tell, we're going to sanction companies, we're going to sanction anybody, kind of basically just saying, don't buy cobalt from the DRC. They should just go plain on that. We're just not going to buy cobalt from the DRC, no matter what, coming from no matter who. Because If we go down that path, there's today absolutely no company where you're going to say, I'm 100% sure that there is no one single gram of cobalt which is not mined by children in that supply chain of industrial companies. So basically, they should just say that. Because if they don't say that, they go like, we're going to try to do this. They won't change the situation on the ground. Poverty will remain. People will move from cobalt to go do something on cassiterite, on coltan, on gold. People will still move from one product to another product to do the same. So when they do that, I'm really kind of wonder what's the goal they're trying to achieve here. To change this issue, to make people not go to artisanal mine, to make children not to go to those artisanal mining sites. I'm really like to do that. But what's the approach here? What's the end goal here?
The end goal, I think, is to get children out of the mining process.
But that should not be the approach then. That should not be the approach because they don't address the cause of the problem. They just address people who are feeding off the consequence of a problem that exists already there.
So you have to be very careful with these types of laws. Let's go back to around 2010. And that was the introduction of the Dodd-Frank law. And as part of the Dodd-Frank law, there was the kind of cleaning up and tightening of the cobalt supply chain in the Congo.
It was the coltan.
Coltan, that's right. And what it did was they put all of these regulations on it, and the Western companies that were involved said, we can't meet these guidelines. They pulled out. What ended up happening was a lot of Chinese companies came in, took a lot of that business, and it didn't ultimately solve the problem because the Chinese were not accountable to that law.
Not even the Chinese companies. What happened on the ground was the fact that now you had local Congolese with the corruption on the ground. They just managed to fake the tag that was required by the ITA to get the tag, the original tag.
Those were the blue tags. There was the blue tags that validated that it was clean cobalt or clean coltan. Yeah.
And last year, I believe, there was a report coming that how there is a mafia that took place because of the Dodd-Frank law. So when you go in the east of the DRC, you still see miners, children, and artisanal mining in coltan, in cassiterite, and it didn't change anything. It just gave the mafia another face. People just adapted to the context. And what ended up happening again, country like Rwanda became main exporters of those minerals because what people will do, they'll take it from the DRC, they go to Rwanda, they clean it up, and it's out. When it's out, it's automatically clean. And at the end, you just realize that they just did nothing. It was those pieces of legislation where say, okay, big companies go out of the supply chain, but those big companies remain down the supply chain. They just say, we're not going to do the dirty business. We're not going to get ourselves involved, but we're still going to find a way. And they did find a way because the locals, politicians, the Congolese citizens, the neighboring countries, Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi, all those countries manage and find a way to create I would say, quote-unquote, legality and cleanness around those minerals. And at the end, they're still on the open market. So the same thing's going to happen with cobalt. When they do that, I really don't see how they're solving the issue of child laborers, not only in cobalt, but in different segments of the economy in DRC, because DRC is rich, and they're just going to go to another sector of the economy.
And let's not forget that this is not uniquely a Congolese problem. Just this week, we got news that BMW encountered or discovered labor violations in a Moroccan cobalt plant. BMW does not source any cobalt from the Congo, specifically because of the human rights problems, and then ran into problems in a mine in Morocco. So again, this is a much bigger problem. I don't think it has anything to do with child labor specifically, but there were labor issues there. Let's continue on.
But let me add a bit of a note when you say BMW does not source cobalt from the DRC. There was this interesting report that came out from the Resource Matters that shows you how in what BMW produce in terms of cars and batteries, you do find a bit of cobalt coming from the DRC. It goes from KTL to Huayo Cobalt and Kamoto Copper Mining in DRC. Even BMW still has a bit of Congolese cobalt in it.
Okay, well, I'm sure BMW would be thrilled to hear that. But let's continue on. So while there was a part of this discussion that was, I thought, very interesting and surprisingly well-informed, again, go back to Milos's testimony, and even Chris Smith, who I don't always agree with on a lot of things, I thought there were some interesting points, and at least there's some new thinking here. These hearings also serve as a platform for the clown show. And the clown show in Washington is just these people who are not at all informed on the issues and kind of regurgitate old, washed-up narratives. And one of those guys who does that is Eric Schultz. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Zambia. Now, bear in mind, he was the U.S. envoy to Zambia 10 years ago. I looked through his profile, and he has a lot of European experience. He was also the deputy chief of mission in, I think it was Zimbabwe as well.
And Ukraine, I think.
In Ukraine, lots of European experience. Does not appear that he has any China experience or any China expertise in his background. And I think you'll hear that come out loud and clear from his testimony.
I can talk a little bit about what I saw in Africa when I served there and how China works there, right? China provides money to Africa, at least in theory. The whole Belt and Road Initiative is, I think I misspoke earlier when I said that they've devoted millions of dollars to preventing or trying to exclude the United States from African markets. It's of course, billions, right, and probably tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions. So the way it works, actually, in simple terms, is, like the Chinese come to an African country and they say, we think you need a road from point A to point B. We're willing to finance it. We'll give you a project loan to build that road. But in return for that money, you have to agree to sole source. So it has to be a Chinese company. It has to be Chinese labor. It has to be Chinese materials, Chinese equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, there's no follow-on effect in the local economy because no local people are working on the projects. It's only Chinese labor that's brought into the country and often is demobilized in place. And so you end up with a Chinese minority in an African country where it never existed before.
Ambassador, you would say then that all roads in the Belt and Road Initiative really are leading to Beijing. I mean, at the end of the day...
That's a very nice way of putting it. I would say that, yes.
And I would concur with you on this. Look, at this point, we are China is by all means economically exploiting other countries.
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's a debt trap,
right?
And what the sweetener is, of course, is that they're offering the government in power money under the table. So in Zambia, when I was ambassador there, it was pretty clear that the previous government, that there were officials in it that were getting a piece of the pie. So they were being paid to accept these projects that the country really didn't need.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. We're not going to go into the debt trap part because we've done that enough. But a couple things there. So he's right on a couple points there. Number one, the fact that these are, used Chinese contractors and it's Chinese equipment and it's oftentimes Chinese materials that are used to build the infrastructure. But his argument that there's no follow-on effect of what he calls, at the end of the day, that's not true. There's a road. There's a piece of infrastructure. That's number one. Number two, all the evidence and all the data and all the research says loud and clear that the Chinese respond to local host demands. So it is not the Chinese saying you need a road and you're going to get a loan. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of how this goes. And it is shocking that in 2023, with everything that we know about Chinese lending in Africa, from the aid data research to Johns Hopkins to Chatham House to Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, I could go on for an hour, Carnegie, all of them, Chatham House, we know a lot about how the Chinese operate in Africa. This guy is so far off base, it's just comical. But literally, he is informing a very, very high-profile congressional committee. And that's what is so troubling. I mean, it's amazing. And again, here's what's interesting. In the entire 2.5-hour testimony and event that this went on this week, the word Glencore was not mentioned once. There's not a single reference to Glencore at all in the 2.5 hours. And that's important because Glencore is either the number one or the number two. It's just about to lose its number one spot, I think, to China Mali this year. But it is, up until now, it's been the number one exporter of cobalt from the DRC. And the fact that they did not contextualize the Chinese against what Glencore and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Kazakhs and all the other actors who are active in the cobalt sector is, again, why this is very troubling, these hearings. And the other part about the child labor that I want to draw attention to, because it is not just an issue in the DRC. And in fact, it was funny because one of my favorite shows is Last Week Tonight, hosted by the comedian John Oliver. And just a couple of weeks ago, literally just 2 weeks ago, he did a fantastic segment on child labor in the chocolate business in Ivory Coast and in Ghana. And it was so revealing. And it's just the same thing as what we see in the DRC, where it's evident, the companies know about it, the governments know about it, and nobody's done anything. Let's take a listen to John Oliver's closing remarks on his segment about child labor in the chocolate sector.
So if we are serious about getting child labour out of our chocolate, we can't keep relying on pinky promises and the honour system. We need tough legislation that requires companies do the right thing. And it's not like this is the only industry where exploitation in other countries is the norm. I could just as easily have done this piece about coffee or palm oil. And we actually talked about trafficking and child labour in the US farm system this year. But experts themselves say of chocolate, in few industries is the evidence of objectionable practices so clear, the industry's pledges to reform so ambitious, and the breaching of those promises so obvious. Look, we have known for 20 years what the problems are here, and we haven't bothered to fix them.
One of the major violators of child labor laws is Mars, which is an American company. And yet, according to John Oliver's report and others, and I've seen this for years, nothing has been done to curtail the use of child labor. And I think this brings up the point that I want to bring up with you, which is that is the focus on the Congo because of child labor, or is the focus on the Congo because of China?
Nah, the focus is on Congo because of China. Let's face it. Let's not be hypocritical about it. Because if they wanted to address the issues really about child laborers and they wouldn't take that approach. They took that approach and because it's China. And let's see where the testimony happened. The testimony happened on the Congress Committee on China. It's addressing China malignant influence in Africa. So yes, it's not because of what's happening in DRC. It's not because of the Congolese people. It's because of China is present there. And as long as the strategy is to curtail and to remove China from that supply chain, to address the China's presence there, they're gonna be fine with it. They're gonna be fine with it because let's face it, the US hasn't done much in terms of asking for good governance in the mining industry with the current president in DRC. They haven't done much. As soon as he showed colors that he was more pro-US than pro-China, they kind of let him go and slide with so many political violation, even bad governance in the mining industry, until they realized that few years down the line, the guy didn't really move the needle to the US companies, and they start talking about it again. And that's why I say it's very hypocritical. It's not about DRC well-being. It's not about the well-being of Congolese people. It's just because it just happened to be that you have Chinese there. And if we can address that, that's going to be a good thing. And in the beginning of the testimony, they were saying, we are at war. We are at war. So basically, I would say this is just one of strategy to address an enemy in the war they're facing in Africa with China.
So, Geraud, the timing of this discussion that we're having today about supply chains and critical resources and obviously labor involving the Chinese, African countries, and the U.S. is perfect because it coincides with a new paper that came out recently by Zainab Usman, a senior fellow and director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and Alex Csnadi, a research assistant in the Carnegie Africa program. The paper is entitled, How Can African Countries Participate in U.S. Clean Energy Supply Chains? Geraud and I had a chance to speak with Zainab and Alex last week to find out more about how they think the U.S. can close the gap with China for access to critical minerals. Zainab Usman, Alex Csnadi, good morning to both of you. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning. It's great to have you on the program.
Good morning, Eric. Thanks for having us.
Very good morning.
So you asked the question, how can African countries participate in U.S. clean energy supply chain? Zainab, let's start with you. Maybe give us the overview of what you're recommending in this paper.
Sure. Before I get into what we're recommending, I think I want to address one or two questions. The why, sort of give a background explainer, because I think that is also very, very important. So why did we even decide to do this analysis to examine the opportunities for a US-Africa partnership in clean energy supply chains? And then what are the specific opportunities and what are the recommendations? And my co-author, Alex, is going to join in giving this overview. We decided to do this work because of maybe two or three key reasons. We are aware that the United States is making efforts to build out new clean energy supply chains in order to be competitive in the industries of the future, thinking about AI, high tech, etc. But in clean energy supply chains and industries in particular, for the low carbon future that we all need to move to in order to address the threat of climate change. But also the US is trying to achieve specific national security objectives of reducing reliance on supplies of clean energy hardware, low emissions hardware from economic competitors and adversaries. At the same time, we know that African countries have, for the longest time, been trying to achieve certain economic and development objectives of increasing their productivity, of achieving industrialization, and therefore pulling their people out of poverty. And they seek to achieve these objectives by leveraging their natural resources endowments. We know that there are oil and gas-rich countries, but very importantly, there are mineral-rich countries, at least about 20, that produce and extract and export different kinds of mineral resources. So having looked at these, or being aware of these objectives of many African countries, but also of the United States, we saw synergies there. But then personally, I became not only curious, but also exasperated by the kind of two-dimensional discourse around the implications of the climate-related legislation enacted in the United States, that is the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and also the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And I had a couple of people message me from African countries, from elsewhere, with a lot of panic that these climate-related legislation would kind of undercut African countries, would put them at a disadvantage. But also within the US too, certain policy experts who held the same view, which I thought was partially true, but I felt that there was a lot more. To me, I was looking at the text of these legislations, I was following the discourse, and I also saw opportunities there. So we decided to actually do an in-depth analysis of these climate-related legislations and to then identify the opportunities for advancing a US-Africa partnership in clean energy supply chains. So what are these opportunities that we identify? We identify 3 of them. Again, within the framework of these climate-related legislations enacted in the US, specifically by the Biden administration since 2021. And across these 3 areas, we find that there is a total of close to $50 billion in appropriations that could be relevant for advancing this partnership. But I want to make it clear that these resources, these funds, they're not devoted or meant for Africa. No, not at all. But when you look at the text of the legislation, the text of the bills, there's language there around advancing international partnerships, of working with foreign partners, of international development. All of these mean that, there could be opportunities there for African countries and indeed maybe countries in Southeast Asia. So the first opportunity that we identify is around transition minerals and battery material processing. As we know, the US is seeking to secure supplies of strategic minerals, transition minerals, or critical minerals as they are called. We prefer to use the term transition minerals because it's a bit more encompassing. So minerals like graphite, copper, chromium, the platinum group of metals, etc. And they're trying to increase the domestic production of electric vehicle batteries as well as low emissions technology hardware. What is very interesting is many of these minerals used as input for the production of these low emissions technologies are predominantly imported, and specifically in some cases, they are already imported by US companies and the US more broadly from African countries. So in the paper itself, we have this chart, figure 2, entitled Major Suppliers of Select Critical Minerals to the United States, where we kind of map out the minerals that are already being imported from African countries, including South Africa for the platinum group of metals, including graphite from Madagascar, and the likes, right? So there is a basis there for expanding this already pre-existing trade between the United States and Africa in transition minerals and metals. Because there are, as I mentioned earlier, over 20 mineral-producing countries on the continent in which the mineral sector accounts for more than 25% of exports. And indeed, many of these countries themselves have been pursuing a mineral-based development strategy as an economic strategy since the 1960s. I think about at least 4 or 5 countries, Ghana, Tanzania, Nigeria, Zambia, among others, that really have been interested in using these mineral resources as a basis for achieving greater economic development. But this is also reflected in continent-wide strategy documents. So there is an opportunity there, but here is a but, and the caveat that in these new climate-related legislations, there are strong local content provisions. Now, I use the term local content in a sense as a kind of I think it's a more neutral term than what words that others have been using, such as protectionism.
But local content means non-Chinese, right? I mean, that is really what it means.
In a sense, yes, it is non-Chinese. It is making sure that supplies of these minerals are not coming from Chinese sources or what is called foreign entities of concern in the legislation. So what this means, and this is specifically in the IRA, in particular the Inflation Reduction Act. And what this means is that there are 2 distinct scenarios that we see involving African countries with respect to the relationship between the United States and Africa in clean energy supply chains. One is really a continuation of the status quo, that African countries whose mineral value chains are not that well integrated with the United States may never be able to join this North American ecosystem that is being built out. So again, in the report, we have this chart, which is very dramatic, on the minerals and metals exports from Africa to 3 parts of the world: the European Union, the United States, and China. And for the US, the curve is actually flat, basically, because there isn't that much happening. For the EU, you find that the curve kind of goes up a bit. It's on a slow ascending trend. But for China, it is like on a rapid ascent. So basically, if the status quo continues, there's just going to be an increased divergence between the trade between Africa and China with respect to minerals and metals, and the trade with respect to the United States. But
So Zainab,
go ahead.
No, excuse me. So you are now really digging into that conversation that we wanted to have with our audiences. And let me just roll back a bit on the opportunities that you've presented, because you listed a few opportunities in terms of transition of supplies and battery manufacturing. Because in the paper, you also mentioned research and development, data collection, and everything. Really very interesting opportunities. So for me, can we roll back a bit, going back into the legislation themselves? Because most of our listeners, they're not really familiar on those legislation. So can you just, in few words, kind of break down how those legislation kind of can be impacted or are somehow connected, both from the American perspective in terms of the interest that you mentioned, but also from an African perspective on how it can match African interest into that. So very in short, so people can kind of understand, because now we are really getting into the crust of the discussion that we are having today.
Okay. So I wonder if maybe Alex might want to speak on that. Alex?
Sure, happy to. I think in terms of making things concrete, maybe an example would be helpful. And I'll choose to speak from the second bucket of opportunities that we identify on R&D and commercialization. I think something that I'm personally sort of interested in is the subnational innovation concept. And with respect to the legislation, one of the big pieces that came out, I think, from the IRA and that has since been announced rather recently by the Biden administration are these regional technology and innovation hubs, which are dispersed pretty evenly throughout the US. And the opportunity that we see here is to leverage, while this is an ostensibly domestic-facing sort of initiative in terms of spurring innovation and job growth in the US, there are existing partnership frameworks, both at the state and city level, with partnership frameworks that include engagements with African countries. So, for example, in Buffalo, New York, one of the recently announced hubs is around semiconductor manufacturing. And New York has an existing US-AFRICOM state partnership with South Africa, and Buffalo has sister city partnerships with cities in Ghana. So there are basically existing frameworks within which these ostensibly domestic-facing innovation hubs can be directly translated, both in terms of knowledge diffusion, but also perhaps participation by either African firms or diaspora firms to really sort of benefit from what are otherwise perhaps domestically looking initiatives and policies. So hopefully that qualifies a little bit.
What do they actually do? I don't quite understand. I mean, what are the practical, tangible outcomes of these innovation centers?
Okay, so let me address that. And to address that, I'm going to kind of zoom out a bit to an aspect of Geraud's question. The three key legislations are domestic, right? Starting with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was enacted in 2021. I think a few months after President Biden was inaugurated. Again, this was meant to achieve a number of objectives, including helping America kind of, shore up its infrastructure base. I think there were a number of provisions around charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and there were a number of other provisions around clean energy, right? So that was the first one. Then the second one was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed, I think, in August or so of 2022. Now, as you know, because you've also asked this question within the context of our audiences here who might not be very familiar with these bills, the Inflation Reduction Act, the name is very kind of misleading because it's a very kind of expansive legislation meant to help America be more competitive in the production
it sounds more economic than
exactly. on competitive in the manufacturing of clean energy technology hardware. So electric vehicles in particular, the manufacturing of those, because as you know this more than I, China is now the biggest manufacturer and exporter of electric vehicles around the world. So at the time when the Inflation Reduction Act was being debated and negotiated, the idea was, how can we make America be more competitive in the production of electric vehicles and the associated components, particularly the batteries? Then also solar panels, wind turbines, and all of these things. But there's also a consumer element. So beyond the supply side, that is the aspect of production and manufacturing, there's the consumer and the demand side, trying to kind of stir up and encourage and incentivize demand for these new clean energy technologies, particularly electric vehicles. Because again, the reality is that in America, internal combustion engine vehicles are still more preferred by the average consumer, whether it's people driving trucks or the SUVs, etc. So trying to incentivize and encourage consumers through tax credits that are meant to be given to companies that produce electric vehicles, but that produce these vehicles domestically. And then the final legislation is the Chips and Science Act. Again, the same thing, trying to make America more competitive. I think the Chips and Science Act has more provisions around semiconductor manufacturing, but there are also clean energy components. So just one final point to kind of round and square up this question is, with respect to the clean, the regional technology hubs that Alex was talking about and that Eric asked further questions about, we think that this is actually very exciting. If these regional technology hubs are to kind of become activated in a sense, we think that there might be an opportunity there for further partnerships with African countries. And, Alex already gave you an example of Buffalo, New York. I can give you two other examples. One is the city of Los Angeles. The new mayor, she's been in office now for a couple of months, is Karen Bass. And Karen Bass used to be the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights. So she was like a strong Africa advocate in the US Congress, now has transitioned to become the mayor of one of the biggest cities in the US. And she is very interested in doing an Africa outreach. The state of Virginia is also interested in doing Africa outreach. I know because we've been in communications with, different entities here. So there's an opportunity here to rethink the US-Africa relationship at a subnational level and to see what could happen there. And that's kind of one of the things that we identify in our report.
Yeah, so Zainab and Alex, when I hear this, and this is not you, obviously, because you're with the Carnegie Endowment, you're not with the U.S. government, but so much of the discussion in the United States about Africa is aspirational. It's if only we can mobilize our private sector, if only we can mobilize cities like Los Angeles. She wants to do this. Meanwhile, you receive our newsletter, and we track this every day. The Chinese have just opened up a $450 million processing center for lithium in Nigeria. $2.8 billion has gone into Zimbabwe. The Tenke Fungurume mine is going to get an additional $2 billion. We're not talking about aspirations when we talk about the Chinese. They're pumping billions of dollars into the very thing that you're trying to jumpstart in the United States. And I wonder how much of this is aspirational and how much of this is actually tangible, things we can touch and see and measure. Alex, what do you think of that discrepancy that I'm laying out?
Well, I think it's fair as you lay it out. I personally see, in terms of a way forward, the subnational piece as being perhaps more tractable and easier to operationalize in the immediate term, to actually move from aspirational to concrete. But, at the end of the day, I understand what you're saying. And of course, we're all talking about an uncertain world. So it's hard to, make confident claims about how exactly step 1 will translate into step 10.
When you mentioned, because I heard Zainab, you also mentioned that the subnational approach from the US perspective toward Africa. From an African perspective, African government tends to like to deal with central government, to deal, with those people in power, because we kind of have the feeling that is the one who's in capital in DC, in London, are the one who's deciding. The subnational are the kind of those who are coming after. And when they deal with China, it's pretty much the same approach. They say, we prefer deal with, the national and everything. So in your paper, you kind of go in that route of subnational mayor and cities and towns and, states to approach Africa. Do you get the feeling that African will be confident enough to move in that direction, to engage with them in those discussions, or they just take it like, one of those initiatives that it's not really, really the real initiative they're expecting? What the feeling that you get when you talk with different stakeholders, both in America and also in Africa?
Yeah. So what we do in the report is that with the recommendations that we put out, and indeed with the entire report, at least a third of it is devoted to recommendations for the very reason that we don't just want to do something that is like esoteric and academic and it's interesting to read, but at the end of the day, you're like, okay, what do I do next? That's the kind of feedback we've gotten from actually a lot of stakeholders, that they want research, they want analysis, but they want it to be useful. So that's what we attempted to do. Our recommendations are very, very detailed, and there are 8 of them. And at least 2 of those recommendations are devoted to or directed at African stakeholders. And of the 2, there's one in particular that we direct at national governments, which is that they need to do a better job of understanding the US policy environment, the federal government. So here's the thing. And I'm not going to mention any country here. I don't want to put them on the spot. Trust me, I've had so many.
You'll get in trouble, Zainab, so be careful here.
I know.
No more embassy parties for you.
Exactly. And those embassy parties are everything. No, but on a serious note, and people are open to listening, which is why I tend to be a bit optimistic. I know the conversations I'm having with people. And we've had to tell a number of them that, look, when you are engaging with the US, don't just stop at the State Department and your desk officer. Of course, that is an important counterpart for you. But there are at least 17 departments and agencies, even within the US federal government, that are doing various things on Africa, right? Department of Energy, Department of Treasury, so on and so forth. So you need to have a proper mapping of who does what. And one of the recommendations that we have is that these embassies, they need the political support of their home governments to be able to appoint a competent cadre of political and economic counselors. They are the ones who are supposed to be doing these mappings and establishing the relationships. But beyond the federal government, they also need to have a better understanding of the states. And unfortunately, it's a bit difficult for some African countries to understand how a federal government works, because they themselves might have the European style central government, right? Where you don't necessarily have that clear kind of devolution or decentralization of power. But increasingly more of them are understanding. So what it means concretely is that when you're trying to do investment promotion, when you're trying to do outreach to US investors, you have to leave Washington, D.C. the investors, the private sector, they're not in DC. They might have liaison offices and the public relations divisions, but they're really not in DC. They're all over the United States, right? In what is it, in Texas, Florida, all the states, the Midwest, etc. So that is something that we know, I think more countries, more embassies are really interested in doing. But beyond that, I think another point I want to make here is what we also do in our reports, because this has been very evident to me working in the space now for 3 years, is the US actually has a lot of tools and instruments with respect to international economic relations and foreign policy that are underutilized. So we make a big deal about the African Growth and Opportunity Act. This is a unilateral trade preference program that allows African countries to be able to export duty-free to the United States for certain product categories. I think it's a total of like 5,000 product categories, including what is permitted under GSP. A lot of countries are just not utilizing AGOA as much as they could be, right? So this is an opportunity to think about how do we make this tool that already exists better? So across the board, you find that there are actually instruments to promote investments, to promote trade that are just not being utilized properly within the United States. And in some cases, you really don't have to reinvent the wheel.
You know, it's interesting because we often talk about the need for improved China literacy across Africa, but it also seems like there's a need for improved U.S. literacy as well. It's a much more complicated political system, and especially now where the political changes in both in Washington and the states, in the regions, you know, around the country are changing so fast. It is hard to keep up, and many people may have gone to school in the United States 20 years ago, and that may be their frame of reference, and the country is very different today. You guys both quoted this question of the minerals and the battery, the critical resources, that the United States produces only 4% of the world's lithium, 13% of the cobalt, none in the nickel space, none in graphite. And so therefore, it does require the ability to source those materials elsewhere. The problem is a lot of those resources are in places like Africa, where the Chinese are already very active. You've pointed out that the Inflation Reduction Act has a number of stipulations that says, well, we don't want to touch any part of the Chinese supply chain in those critical resources. There is still a fantasy in Washington that the United States can somehow source cobalt, nickel, and these other resources absent the Chinese. That either means on the mining side or the transportation side or the refining side. All three of those steps oftentimes have Chinese entities up and down the supply chain. Geraud, you did some research this summer that we released, the first time that the cobalt supply chain in the Congo was mapped, and you found that many of the Western companies, Canadian, European, even to some extent the Japanese and others, are fully intertwined with the Chinese in the DRC. And it really raises the point as to whether or not it's ever going to be possible to segregate the U.S. supply chain from that of a non-Chinese supply chain. So, Alex, let me kind of put that on your doorstep. Do you also work on that assumption in the report that there is a possibility of creating a parallel supply chain that has no contact with Chinese entities?
Nice, easy question, certainly. So I take your point, and I think it's a very important one. I think my sort of gut answer to that is that while, yes, the integration with Chinese companies being sort of present up and down these supply chains is certainly a fact today, one of the things that I think we lay out in box 2 of the report is that this has not always been the case. And if you take sort of a couple of decades as the recent history, it's really a recent phenomenon that there was this retrenchment of U.S. both public and private involvement in these same supply chains. So at the sort of simplest level, I would say that yes, there is a possibility of a different future because we have evidence of a very different past from not a very different past from the not so distant past, right? We're talking about Tenke Fungurume, the Freeport McMoran only divested in 2016, right? And this was obviously controversial at the time. And, there's a question of whether the status quo now will be one which can be changed. But at the end of the day, it's one in which if the interest is there, I think the outcome is certainly possible. It just is a matter of whether there is concerted sort of policy and investment.
And do you get the sense there's any interest? I mean, I haven't seen any activity in years for U.S. companies to move into meaningfully, again, on the scale of Tenka Fungurume. There's a little bit, there's a cobalt initiative in Zambia, but these are all relatively small. We're talking multi-billion-dollar moves into these sectors to compete with the Chinese. Do you get the sense that there's any interest, any momentum on that side?
I suppose that's difficult for me to answer. I don't have direct, evidence of interest as such, and I think maybe the future will probably look a little bit more subtle than that. I doubt it will be a replication of sort of past involvement directly in terms of, yes, as you say, these multi-billion-dollar capital outlays at the start and involvement in mining, which has perhaps ESG concerns, et cetera. But there are, as you mentioned earlier, lots of different components of that value chain. And I think there maybe are sort of diffused opportunities along there that there are interests from U.S. private sector actors in becoming involved with. I think that is a much fairer statement.
Yeah. Geraud, this is a space that you follow very closely. Maybe give your take on this.
Yes, I wanted to give it back to Zainab because at the beginning when she was talking, she mentioned about the willingness to remain in the status quo or to change the context. Alex was mentioning, it was not far away than we still had Freeport-McMoRan in DRC, and we had some American companies there, and they sold their share to a Chinese company. In the same time, the political landscape has changed in many African countries. They got in touch with Chinese since the 2000s. They get used to the way of Chinese of doing businesses. They kind of become more, I'd say, accustomed to the approach of, how Chinese companies approach Africa. And then you have the US who's trying to come back. So for me to be like I'm going to be giving it to Zainab. Do you get the sense now that from the African perspective, there is this willingness, because I assume there is an assumption that African countries that, they do want also to change. They want a different approach. But do you get the sense that from an African perspective, that those African countries want something different? They want to move from the status quo to much a more diverse mining landscape where they get more integration to the American supply chain and all.
Yeah. So there are, I would say, two parts to that question. The perspective of African countries, what is it that they want? Do they actually want a change of the status quo? Yes, they do. And then the other part of the question is this even realistic that the status quo can be changed in terms of, even for African countries, diversifying the destination of their exports from China to just having a variety of destinations? That's very questionable, but there are things, I think it's doable, but whether the will exists and whether the staying power from the United States, or maybe from the Europeans, to continue to engage in this sector and to ensure that the engagement is very different from that of the past, as Alex mentioned. Again, huge question marks around that. So let me start with the first part of the question with respect to what African countries want. It's very interesting when you attend any forum related to economic development or investments or trade, etc., or even just maybe on just Africa's future convened by whether the African Union or the African Development Bank or the regional economic communities. One word that always comes out the end of the forum in a communique is like value addition. Value addition. Now it's like everywhere. We want to add value to our natural resources, to our commodities. Certainly the AGOA forum that just concluded, I think every session at some point I just got tired of hearing the word value addition. But it's everywhere. And it's not.
It's become the mantra.
It's the mantra, exactly. They want to do more refining, more processing of these commodities. A bit, I would say personally, a bit unrealistically, they want to start assembling batteries. I don't know if that's going to happen within the next 5 years. It takes a while. You have to kind of go up the value chain.
They don't have the energy for it in many countries.
Exactly. And before I start getting hate mail after this podcast, it's not that I'm saying African countries shouldn't assemble batteries. I'm just talking about the feasibility of doing that in the next 3 to 5 years. But refining and processing, I think that is totally doable, and many countries are determined, right? But here's the interesting thing. They want to get investments from the West here being the United States, being Europe. And again, we talk to them. I participate in roundtables. I participate in a lot of these meetings. I have some countries even reaching out to us to ask if we can help. So the interest is there. The demand is there. Now, is the supply happening from the United States, from Europe, from even multilateral development banks? Not really. Because once you start talking to certain kinds of investors, then the story is, Africa is, the environment is this and that. And it's true, there are valid points being made there, whether it's with respect to corruption, the lack of infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Those are valid points. But the African business environment is not that, in many countries, is not that fundamentally different from Indonesia. I'm sorry, you look at different indicators and you find that they're actually very comparable. A Kenya, or a Botswana or a Namibia. In fact, on certain, whether it's governance indicators, some African countries rank higher than some Southeast Asian countries, right? So then you start to question whether people are even interested in doing these things. So I think that is really the crux of the matter, that for a lot of African countries, there is the demand and they want to engage extensively with Western investors and Western public actors. But that supply is not always forthcoming. But to be fair also, increasingly now, and as we're seeing in the US, there are people, whether in the public sector, whether within various departments of the US federal government, or as we mentioned, the subnationals, increasingly interested in doing more outreach to Africa, doing investment promotion strategies. We have the Prosper Africa at USAID. There's now a new coordinator. She seems very, very engaged. So there is that there are more efforts being made. Whether that actually results in, and this perhaps gets me to the second part of the question, whether these efforts actually make headway, whether there is consistency and staying power among US policymakers to ensure that you actually promote investments. In addition to promoting trade, you promote investments in processing and refining that African countries want, is another question entirely.
Yes, that's definitely one of the things we kind of wonder from an African perspective, because from an African perspective, we have that feeling that, the US always go big talks, big announcements, big declaration, they say we're going to put that much money. We are trying to do something on the ground, but we keep on waiting that much at the point that we're like, the US is not really serious. I remember I was talking to a mining executive in one African country that I won't mention. He was saying, yes, the American, they talk big talk. When they invite us, we go, we be there, but we also do know that at some point that they will never deliver, because when it comes to deliver, there's always that sense that, something can change in the US administration, something can change in the Congress, that at the end, all the promise that was made before, 3-4 years before, will change today. So this is where now my next question comes into understanding how the recommendation that you've put in place, the suggestions and the approach that you've put in place can survive political change and landscape in the US.
And I think Alex might want to add to this too, but I'll go first. It is definitely true that increasingly now in the United States, there's a bit of, I would say, political uncertainty. That at the moment there is a new government, new administration in the White House who may not necessarily know how certain kinds of international agreements and foreign policy decision-making will be headed. And in fact, it is this thinking and this concern that really is informing a lot of the accelerated discussions around the reauthorization of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And I think for me, the good news just coming out of that forum a couple of days ago is that there seems to be broadly some kind of consensus among African policymakers and even US policymakers in the executive as well as Congress that, look, we need to authorize AGOA ASAP. It is a tool that is not without its faults, but it's still good. It's still good enough. And especially now in the turbulent trade environment where it's very difficult for the US to negotiate new free trade agreements, you have a trade preference program. Let's make do with what we have. So that, I think there's that understanding. At the same time, when it comes to Africa policy, it still remains one of the few domains of foreign policy that remains bipartisan. across both the Republicans and the Democrats here in the US, whether it's with respect to AGOA. Again, just a couple of days ago, before the forum started, a bipartisan group of US senators, I think about 12 or 13 of them, signed a letter urging the leadership of Congress to prioritize the authorization of AGOA, right? The two authorization bills put forward so far are from Senator John Kennedy, a Republican from the state of Louisiana, and Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from, I think, the state of Delaware, if I'm not mistaken. So it is bipartisan. Prosper Africa, and I know the Trump administration gets a lot of flack, but we also need to give them credit. They initiated Prosper Africa, which the Biden administration today is running with. Before them, there was no Prosper Africa. So again, you can see the bipartisanship. But
and do we think Prosper Africa has been a success? I mean, I haven't seen any tangible kind of talking points. I mean, PEPFAR is the last big successful policy that the United States has had in Africa, which was 25 years ago. I think Power Africa has largely been described as a disappointment. Prosper Africa, I just haven't seen any proof points that show what they've been able to accomplish with it. The deal teams, all the different rhetoric that came out of it, leveraging private sector investment, trade numbers haven't gone up, FDI numbers haven't gone up. I don't know where the confidence that Prosper Africa has been a success comes from.
Well, one way to look at Prosper Africa, now I feel like their spokesperson. I definitely
No, and I don't want to put you don't represent the government, so you're not meant to defend that, by the way. You're not meant to defend that.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the way I see it is that as a new initiative, it was announced by the Trump administration. This was, I think, a year or two before the 2020 election. Then there was a new administration, and then they had to find a new coordinator. And I think there were like a couple of complexities around finding a coordinator and head of Prosper Africa, which they have now. So we'll have to wait to see what they achieve. But I think it's an absolutely valid question. What does Prosper Africa achieve? What can it do? I think that really needs to be something that gets asked often.
Well, these are fascinating questions. And if you want to deep dive into U.S.-Africa policy, this report is the way to do it. How can African countries participate in U.S. clean energy supply chains? It's a beefy report. This is not a one-pager, so you really want to take some time to go through it. It was written by Zainab Usman, who is a senior fellow and director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and also Alex Csnadi, who is a research assistant in the Carnegie Africa program. Zainab, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. We'll put a link to the report in the show notes, but we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Eric. And one thing to add very quickly is that there's actually a summary of the report. In addition to the full report itself, which is like 40 pages long, there is a 4-page summary that we did for people who are too busy and they just need to, yes.
We like the Cliff Notes version of that. We appreciate that. Thank you, Zainab. Thank you, Alex. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Geraud, this is really an important piece of research that they've done. I think if you really want to understand a lot about where the United States is coming from, both positive and negative, you can see it in this report. And Zainab's been around this business for a very long time. She's one of the most knowledgeable people in D.C. on U.S.-Africa policy. So she is definitely the right person to put this report together. However, I think it's fair to say, and I brought this up in a number of points in our conversation, that the United States, and this is not Zainab, this is the United States government and United States society and the United States political system. You know, they're still at the starting line here. You know, they're still trying to organize stuff. They're still trying to mobilize the private sector. They're still trying to get engaged. They're still trying to build proof points around some of their policies like Prosper Africa. They're still trying to get the innovation centers up and running. And I just bring up the fact that, you know what, the Chinese are already down at the, they're down at the 10-yard line already. That's a football reference that you probably won't get. An American football reference you won't get.
Yeah.
But they're closing in, they're already way down the field. Or as you guys would say, way down the pitch.
Exactly.
And I think these are weird academic discussions sometimes that we have, given the realities on the ground. The reality on the ground is that the Tenke Fungurume mine is enormous. The reality on the ground is there is no American cobalt presence in the DRC. The reality on the ground, and this is a point that I wanted to bring up, and you've brought up a number of times. Do American companies really want to be at the bottom of that pyramid in the supply chain, managing the mines in places like the DRC and refining these minerals like cobalt and nickel. It's a dirty, gross, disgusting, violent business.
In very unstable, corrupted environment countries where you're going to have to get your hand dirty to get mining deals, to get your business up and running. You're going to be always your basically your PR agency are going to be always on the lookout for the next NGO reports mentioning your name, mentioning your companies. So you're going to be really...
This explains right there, Geraud. You have explained why American companies are saying, no, thank you. Do you know what I mean? No matter how much people try and rally American companies to be part of this new alternate supply chain that doesn't have the Chinese in it, they don't have the stomach for it. And we don't have the laws for it, by the way, either. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a pretty serious piece of legislation.
Exactly.
And you know what? Not that many companies are prosecuted every year under the FCPA, but many live in fear of it.
But beyond that, you have the public opinion against you. You have the public opinion that can just, in this cancel culture where they can, rally a campaign against you. As a company, you just don't want to have your name on the NGO reports where they talk about child labor, they talk about corruption, they talk about displacement of people, they talk about this and that. You don't want to be there. You really don't want to be there. As a Western or even an American company, you don't want to be there. They're fragile in that regard. Whereas the Chinese, they don't have that. They don't have that backlash of public opinion. Having a legislation or not, they just don't have the backlash that comes with public opinion. So now, when you see a report like this, it's a very interesting report. I've read that and recommend people to download it and to read it. It's gonna take long, but you're gonna find very interesting recommendation. But when you see that, you just, as I raised during the conversation, you just kind of wonder how much African government really wants to move the needle beyond what they say to being polite in those conferences, in those meetings, how much they really, really want to move the needle to have a much more diverse supply chain or mining industry where you have all those Americans and Western companies being part of the discussion. It's really not sure.
It's not sure on that. And again, I think we also have to ask the same questions of the U.S. private sector as well, that many of these reports have the embedded assumption that the U.S. government and U.S. companies are going to be on the same page. Because they oftentimes have the government talking about the private sector as if it's this monolithic entity, this singular entity. And I can guarantee you, based on what we've seen in the deals, that Elon Musk does not see Tesla's future aligned with the national security priorities of the United States. We have seen that over and over again. And so whether that's Elon Musk's huge, robust business with China, selling cars, or his deals with Zhejiang Cobalt, to source cobalt and nickel and other materials that go to power his cars. And that runs completely counter to the Inflation Reduction Act objectives. And he doesn't care.
Yeah, you're mentioning the private sector who doesn't align with the government interest. Even within the administration itself, you do have different voices. You're from the US, you've been to the US recently. You've been hearing different discourses from different people from the Hill, in Washington, in DC. Even within the administration, people do have different approach when it comes to Africa. So even there, you realize that if there's no unity, there's no kind of single view or strategy on what to do in Africa, how they're going to convince the private sector to follow them in that path.
And that's a very good point, because the United States is a deeply, deeply divided. And Zainab referenced political uncertainty, I think was the word she used. I think that's being delicate about it, because you look at the U.S. Congress, in particular the House, they have been very vocal about their objection to the Inflation Reduction Act in large parts of it, even though, ironically, that Republican states have benefited more from the IRA than Democrat states, which is okay. But they don't believe in a lot of the green energy transition. They don't believe in a lot of this stuff. They don't like China, and they do like Africa. There's that. But in terms of whether or not they're willing to put real money, and again, this green transition really offends many people on the far right, and I think that's something to take into account.
This is the comment I also wanted to raise with Zainab. You also said that when they say they do like Africa, I would say they do like the humanitarian side of Africa, they do like the business side of Africa.
I think the first part, you're right. The second part, I'm not sure about. There really isn't much business done between the United States and Africa. At the end of the day, the reason why the U.S.-Africa trade fell was because we didn't need to buy hydrocarbons from Nigeria anymore because we had shale oil in the United States. That the bulk of what the United States continues to buy from Africa is hydrocarbons, is energy. And so there's not really a strong business relationship because at the end of the day, we don't make much. We're a tech and finance and a services economy, right? That's why China is so strong, is because they manufacture a lot of stuff that people buy. And we can sell them KPMG services and we can sell them, but those are very expensive. Apple phones are very expensive compared to Huawei and Transsion phones. So in that sense, we're two very different economies, which is why comparing the US and China in Africa really is a dumb exercise because they're so different in how they approach and what they do. And I think the US has this problem where they're trying to set up China as some kind of peer competitor in Africa, and they simply can't get off the starting line. They really shouldn't be competing head on. They really shouldn't be saying we're going to build alternate supply chains because that's just not the thing. It's just not what the US does.
Yeah, but the US has the technology, and this is where I liked one of the recommendation, one of the opportunities that they see in the reports, when they talk about data collection and analytics. The US has the technology to really help many African countries to at least build a very solid geological map of their own resources. Because let's face it, many African countries, they do negotiate those contracts with a pure ignorance of what they have and what they don't have. So they just deal badly with those mining companies coming from China or coming from Canada or Australia. So in the reports, they mentioned there is an opportunity for the US using its technology, with using its US government survey to really help many African countries to do something in that regard. And I do believe that, yes, over there is an opportunity. But beyond that, are we really going to see the private sector, the US private sector or the US industry come back in Africa? I'm not sure. But so far we have Cobalt back in Zambia trying to unearth one of the biggest, quote unquote, one of the biggest copper deposit in the world. We're going to see. But we are trying, some of them are trying to move the needle. But on the overall, there's still a big gap that the US government and private needs to fill.
I think if you're going to look at new players in the cobalt market and in the critical minerals market, you would be smarter to look at the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kazakhs, and not the Americans. And I think that's where it's going. And that's what your research says. Listen, guys, if you want to follow this, you need to check out Geraud's mapping of the cobalt supply chain. It is a beautiful interactive map. You just go to our homepage at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. You'll see a banner ad in the middle of the page right there for it. It is absolutely spectacular. ChinaGlobalSouth.com/cobalt. We are actually in the process of updating it. Probably somewhere around February or March next year, we're going to add the 2023 data. Is that correct?
Exactly. We're going to add the 2023 data. We're going to update all the information about artisanal mining. And we're going to add some new information we are working on. All of that in the interest of, helping people to get a better knowledge of that supply chain down in the DRC, the change of player. 2022 was interesting. A lot of new players came in, among the Chinese and the Kazakhs. Some went out of business, some came into the business. So you're going to be seeing that on the map that we're going to release for next year, the update we're going to release next year.
And also a heads up that we have a similar mapping of the nickel supply chain in Indonesia coming as well. So we're going to have Indonesia and the DRC on the site by the end of the year. Some very exciting things. Geraud, thank you for joining us today. It was great to have your insights as well. We would love for you to join our conversation. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe and sign up for a subscription to support this podcast and also all the great work that Geraud is doing, Cobus, Johnny, Antonia out in Jakarta. We've got a team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. We really rely on the support that you give us through the subscriptions and also our Patreon community. And if you are a Patreon supporter, Geraud is your guy. He manages the Patreon community, and we just want to say a huge thank you to all of our Patreons. We couldn't do this work without you, and we are just, again, so grateful for your unconditional support. Finally, you should check out our video show that we do now every Wednesday that we drop on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. It's the CGSP Roundtable. Geraud, myself, Cobus, the team, we just get up there and we just have the same conversations that we have with each other all day, and we record it. This is literally how we talk and what we talk about all day. We're such nerds. I mean, it's really quite remarkable, but it's a great show. People seem to like it. Go to youtube.com/the $sign. That's what every channel now gets, the $sign plus China Global South. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So for Geronima in Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.